Have I been muted this whole time? All right. Man, I'll do it. I'll do it from, we'll do it live. We'll go all the way from the beginning. All right. So, all right. Greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Carrico here, Adams Van Sale. And tonight we're doing a special episode for those that have been reading the description or have been doing the effort to read the description of the stream. You'll know that tonight is episode 100 of a Stream of Consciousness, this little show that I do here on my YouTube channel. Now, I think I did episode 1 all the way back in 2018. Now I'm talking under correction, even though I'm talking about my own show. But yeah, it's been an amazing few years since. And I know there's some of my subscribers that I still see in chat that have been subscribers since 2018, since episode 1. They're still watching all the way up to episode 100, and it's really incredible to still see many of these names that have been here for years, following all the stuff that I put out there, and always still helping also by adding to the content. I mean, that's something that I always remind you, the audience, of when I do these types of shows, is that your comments in the comment section, I love incorporating them into the content. You always ask such great questions, and the comments, sometimes I'm a bit too distracted by the live chat because it's just such a jewel going on there. But anyway, welcome to episode 100. I was a bit torn on what to do for episode 100 of Stream of Consciousness, and I ended up deciding on reading one of my favorite essays by Samuel Huntington called The West and the Rest. And I think it's quite pertinent and incisive. It was written in 1997, 25 years ago. But I mean, 2020, I think, is actually a perfect year to read it again. I've reread it so many times, and there's so many valuable insights in there. And I see here we already have people streaming in to take part in the live chat. Welcome. I got caught up between two languages there. I should have just looked at the chat and saw that I was muted, but see there. Maybe looking at the chat more often is a virtue. I see a sideline opinion says, great to have watched your century from the first run. What an innings. 100 not out. Well done. Thank you very much. Glenn is checking in from the Karoo Woestijn, from the Karoo Desert. Thank you very much, and great to see people tuning in from all over. I see Red Sky Alice says, finally I got the stream on time. Hello everyone. All right. So tonight I'm going to be reading from Samuel Huntington's essay, The West and the Rest. And I hope that you find it as insightful as I did every time that I read it. I think really it's an amazing piece of writing. And I think you'll see some interesting parallels between what he was writing in 1997 and what we're seeing today unfold in Ukraine, Russia. In the Ukraine-Russia conflict. All right, so let's get into it. Let me just get the screen sharing. It's episode 100, and I still am very slow with getting the screen shared. So let me see here. No, it's this one. Perfect. Can you see? Oh, yes, you can see. All right. So there's the essay that I'm going to be reading. And I see here Glenn says they're tuning in from Aberdeen in the Karoo. Very nice to see. I've been there. Beautiful, beautiful little town. Peter H says, hallo, lees bietjie vir ons. Ek gaan bietjie lees. Dankie dat jy ingeskakel het. All right. So let's begin. The West and the Rest, written in 1997 by Samuel Huntington. The West won the Cold War, but cannot and should not impose its distinct values on other world civilizations. Samuel Huntington, in an elaboration of his Clash of Civilizations essay published in 1993, argues that the West can only flourish in a more hostile world by abandoning its universal aspirations. In the post-Cold War world, the most important distinctions among people are not ideological, political, or economic. They are cultural. People and nations are attempting to answer the most basic question humans can face. Who are we? And they are answering that question in the traditional way by reference to the things that mean most to them. People define themselves in terms of ancestry, religion, language, history, values, customs, and institutions. They identify with cultural groups, tribes, ethnic groups, religious communities, nations, and at the broadest level, civilizations. People use politics not just to advance their interests, but also, and this is important, to define their identity. We know who are only we know who are only when excuse me. We know who we are only when we know who we are not, and often only when we know whom we are against. Now, this is a powerful first opening paragraph here for Mr. Hunt from Mr. Huntington here, and I think you've already got an idea why I want to read from this amazing essay for episode 100. I'm dedicating to this essay that I really enjoy and think is a valuable piece of writing. Nation states remain the principal actors in world affairs. Their behavior is shaped, as in the past, by the pursuit of power and wealth, but it is also shaped by cultural preferences and differences. The most important groupings of states are no longer the three blocks of the Cold War, but rather the world's 7 or 8 major civilizations. Which are they? Cynic, all scholars recognize the existence of either a single distinct Chinese civilization dating back at least to 1500 BC, or of two civilizations, one succeeding the other in the early centuries of the Christian epoch. While Confucianism is a major component of Chinese civilization, Chinese civilization is more than Confucianism. Japanese, number 2. Some scholars combine Japanese and Chinese culture under a single Far Eastern civilization. Most, however, recognize Japan as a distinct civilization, which was the offspring of Chinese civilization emerging between AD 100 and 400 AD. Hindu, number 3. One or more successive civilizations have existed on the subcontinent since at least 1500 BC. In one form or another, Hinduism has been central to the culture of the subcontinent since the second millennium BC. It has continued to be so even though India has a substantial Muslim community. Next, Islamic. Originating in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century AD, Islam spread rapidly across North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, and also eastward into Central Asia, the subcontinent, and Southern Asia. Many distinct cultures exist within Islam, including Arabic, Turkic, Persian, and Malay. Western, the next one. Western civilization is usually dated as emerging about 700 AD. It has two main components in Europe and North America. Latin American is the next one. Latin America, often considered part of the West, has a distinct identity. It has a corporatist, authoritarian culture, which Europe had to a much lesser degree, and North America not at all. I would say, as I understand corporatist authoritarian culture, I think what we've seen transpire in Canada and over the past 2 years all across the Western world, and specifically in America as well. I would contest what Huntington is saying here, that there's that we haven't seen this at all in North America. But I mean, this was written in 1997. Europe and North America both felt the effects of the Reformation and have combined Catholic and Protestant cultures. Historically, Latin America has been only Catholic, although that may be changing. Latin American civilization also incorporates indigenous cultures which were wiped out in North America. Next, we have Orthodox. This civilization combines the Orthodox tradition of Christianity with the Slav cultures of Eastern Europe and Russia. It has resurfaced since the demise of the Soviet Union. African, possibly. The north of the continent and its east coast belong to the Islamic civilization. Historically, Ethiopia constituted a civilization of its own. Elsewhere, imperialism brought elements of Western civilization. Throughout Africa, tribal identities are pervasive, but Africans are also increasingly developing a sense of African identity, and conceivably sub-Saharan Africa could cohere into a distinct civilization with South Africa at its core. Now, it's very interesting that he writes this in 1997 compared to what we've seen in the years since, up until 2022. Before I continue, I'm just going through some. I'm going to be jumping between the what I'm actually reading and the chat because I can't do it at the same time, unfortunately. I see a Dagbreaker says, "Oh, I like that. Very good." Luel says, "Viva la difference." Uh, Karina Koch says, "Congrats on 700 episodes. Thank you very much." And then Vlakvark says, "Hello, goeie mense." Hello, Vlakvark. All right, let's continue. The term the West is now universally used to refer to what used to be called Western Christendom. The West is thus the only civilization identified by a compass direction and not by the name of a particular people, religion, or geographical area. The name the West has also given rise to the concept of westernization and has promoted a misleading conflation of westernization and modernization. Now, what he touches on here, he's going to go into detail later in the essay, this misleading conflation of westernization and modernization. It's absolutely critical to the argument that he's making here with this essay. So let's see. Where was I? All right, Huntington continues. Modernization is often associated with the idea of a single universal civilization. What people usually mean by universal civilization refers to the assumption and values held by most people in the West and by some people in other civilizations. This might be called the Davos culture. I mean, here Huntington is talking about Davos culture in 1997. He's going to continue. It's going to get very interesting. Each year and he's describing now what he's talking about here. Each year, about 1,000 businessmen, bankers, government officials, intellectuals, and journalists meet in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Almost all the people hold university degrees, work with words, men of letters, and or numbers, and are reasonably fluent in English. They generally share beliefs in individualism, market economics, and political democracy. Davos people, 1997, this guy's talking about the Davos people, control virtually all the international institutions, many of the world's governments. Do you start to realize why I chose this essay to read in 2022, this essay from 1997? But let me continue first and finish with this paragraph. Davos people control virtually all the international institutions, many of the world's governments, and the bulk of the world's economic and military capabilities. The elite Davos culture is thus very important. Worldwide, however, how many people share this culture? Outside of the West, it is probably less than 50 million people, or 1% of the world's population. All right. Where was I? An even more tenuous case for the advance of a single universal Western civilization is based on the spread of US pop culture and consumer goods. This depreciates the strength of other cultures while trivializing Western culture by identifying it with fatty goods, faded pants, and fizzy drinks. The essence of Western culture is the Magna Carta, not the Magna Mac. And you can see this specifically now in our time as well, with multinational corporations, calls from political commentators for multinational corporations like Amazon and Apple and Facebook to be given seats at the UN. And I mean, things have escalated since Huntington wrote this essay in 1997. I think, but still, he noticed this pattern already 25 years ago, quarter of a century. But the connection that he's talking about here. I think that line that he is criticizing here, that line has blurred even more in the past few years. Right. Between that corporate element of the West and actual Western values and virtues. Woke capital comes to mind. Modern societies have much in common, but they do not necessarily merge into homogeneity. The argument that they do rests on the assumption that modern society must form a single type, the Western type, the modern civilization, that modern civilization is Western civilization, and this is arrogant, false, and dangerous. this has been very prescient that he wrote this. Seeing the developments that have happened, you'll see it's going to get more deeper. He's going to add layers to this argument. That's why I adore this essay so much. Most scholars of civilization agree that Western civilization emerged in the 8th and 9th centuries. It did not begin to modernize until the 18th century. The West was Western long before it was modern. What were the distinguishing characteristics of Western civilization before it modernized? They include the classical legacy. As a third generation civilization, the West inherited much from classical civilization. Classical legacies in Western civilization include Greek philosophy and rationalism, Roman law, Latin, and Christianity. Islamic and Orthodox civilizations also inherited from the classical civilization, but to nowhere near the same degree as the West. Western Christianity, Western Christianity is the next element of the Western civilization. Western Christianity, first Catholicism and then Protestantism, is the single most important characteristic of Western civilization. During most of its first millennium, Western civilization was called Western Christendom, where there was a well-developed sense of community among Western Christian peoples, one that made them feel distinct from Turks, Moors, and Byzantines. When Westerners went out to conquer the world in the 18th century, they did so for God as well as gold. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation and the division of Western Christendom into Protestantism and Catholicism and the political and intellectual consequences of that rift are also features of Western history, absent from Eastern Orthodoxy and the Latin American experience. European languages is the next element of Western civilization, according to Huntington. Language is second only to religion as a factor distinguishing one culture from another. Now, just to pause here, this is actually very much apparent in South Africa, this distinction of languages. Now, for example, the Xhosa people in South Africa speak Xhosa or isiXhosa. In the Tswana people in South Africa speak Setswana. The Afrikaners speak Afrikaans, but the Coloreds also speak Afrikaans. The Zulus speak isiZulu, and so on and so forth. So in South Africa, there's a very strong connection between culture, language, and culture and language. And this is exactly what he's talking about here, the element of language in Western civilization as well. And that's very important to take note of, especially, I think, it's a point to ponder. I think for Europeans, it's much more evident, and for South Africans, it's much more evident, this role of language. In a country like America, I don't think it is as evident. It will become more evident as more Spanish speakers enter your country or immigrate to your country. But at the moment, English is still very, very dominant in America. And I think when you swim in a certain type of water, you don't realize that there are other types. I mean, if you are a saltwater fish, you don't know that there's fresh water out there. And fresh water in this case would be societies where there's multilingualism. And then language starts playing a very important role in identity and a connection to culture. And in-group, out-group, and community as well. Now I continue with Huntington's essay. The West differs from most other civilizations in its multiplicity of languages. Japanese, Hindi, Mandarin, Russian, and even Arabic are recognized as the core languages of other civilizations. The West inherited Latin, but a variety of nations emerged in the West, and with them developed a national language grouped loosely into the broad categories of Romance and Germanic. By the 16th century, these languages had generally assumed their contemporary forms. Latin gave way to French as a common international language for the West, and in the 20th century, French succumbed to English. The next element of Western civilization, according to Huntington, is separation of spiritual and temporal authority. Throughout Western history, first the church and then many churches existed separate from the state. God and Caesar, church and state, has been a prevailing dualism. Only in Hindu civilization were religion and politics as clearly separated. In Islam, God is Caesar. In China and Japan, Caesar is God. In Orthodoxy, God is Caesar's junior partner. In Western culture, the division between spiritual and temporal authority contributed immeasurably to the development of freedom. Rule of law, the next element according to Huntington. The concept of the centrality of law to civilized existence was inherited from the Romans. Medieval thinkers elaborated the idea of natural law, according to which monarchs were supposed to exercise their power, and common law tradition developed in England. During the phase of absolutism in the 16th and 17th centuries, the rule of law was observed more in the breach than in practice, but the idea of subordinating human power to some external restraint persisted. The tradition of the rule of law laid the basis for constitutionalism and the protection of human rights, including property rights. In other civilizations, law has been a much less important factor. So I'm just going to check back to chat if there's any things standing out here, and then I'm going to continue. The image bear says, lekker mense hier uit Engeland uit. Yes, ek hoop nie is te koud daarso nie. Let's see here. All right, let's continue. The next element of Western civilization, according to Huntington, let me just check, is this scrolling? Yes, it is. I just wanted to make sure, since that first part of the stream where I was muted, I didn't realize, maybe you guys are screaming at me in the chat that the projection that I'm using here, the text isn't scrolling, but it is. I see Dagbreker says, this is a very good essay, CC. Well, thank you. Oh, I shouldn't say thank you as if I wrote it. But yeah, that's why I chose it for episode 100. It is probably one of my favorite political essays that I've ever read, and I've read it multiple times. But yeah, thank you very much for pointing that out. Not thank you as if I've written it, but thank you for also sharing. I'm glad. Let me just put it simply. What I want to say is I'm very glad that you're enjoying and finding insights in it. All right. The next element, according to Huntington, of Western civilization is social pluralism and civil society. Western society historically has been highly pluralistic. What is distinctive about the West, as Carl Deutsch noted, is, and this is in quotes, is the rise and persistence of diverse autonomous groups not based on blood relationship or marriage, close quote. Beginning in the 6th and 7th centuries, these groups initially included monasteries, monistic orders, and guilds, but afterwards expanded in many areas of Europe to include a variety of other associations. For more than a millennium, the West had had a civil society that distinguished it from the other civilizations. Associational pluralism was supplemented by class pluralism. Most Western European societies included a relatively strong and autonomous aristocracy, a substantial peasantry, and a small but significant class of merchants and traders. The strength of the feudal aristocracy was particularly important in limiting absolutism's ability to take root in most European nations. This European pluralism contrasts sharply with the poverty of civil society, the weakness of the aristocracy, and the strength of the centralized bureaucratic empires that existed during the same periods in Russia, China, and the Ottoman lands. Before I continue, this is why when I was on Alex Kashuta's podcast with Robert Daigen, when she asked for a subversive thinker, one of them that I mentioned was Samuel Huntington. I think he hits some geopolitical points on the head, and you'll see as it continues why I say that. I see a Flakvark asks, "Hey, Conscious Character, will you ever release some more merch?" I am in the process of actually acquiring some more merch that I will be actually just giving away, maybe as the top comment of the stream. I'll send it to someone, but I'm in the process of that. But I will keep my I'll keep my audience up to date. But yeah, it's let's continue here. So the next element of Western civilization, according to Huntington, is representative bodies. Social pluralism gave rise to estates, parliaments, and other institutions that represented the interests of the aristocracy, clergy, and merchants. Oh, it's not. It started to rain outside. Some of the last rains of summer, I think, here in Transvaal. These bodies provided forms of representation that, in the course of modernization, evolved into the institutions of modern democracy. During the era of absolutism, they were abolished or their powers greatly limited. But even when that happened, they could, as in France, be resurrected as a vehicle for expanded political participation. Movements for self-government also developed at the local level, leading to such confederations of strong and independent cities as the Hanseatic League, something that my friend Piet of Sakeliga always talks about. Piet Leroux always talks about the Hanseatic League, and he's very knowledgeable on it. But yeah, representation at the national level was thus supplemented by a measure of autonomy at the local level. Next, individualism. Many of the above features of Western civilization contributed to the emergence of a sense of individualism and a tradition of individual rights and liberties. Individualism developed in the 14th and 15th centuries, and acceptance of the rights of individual choice, which Dutch terms the Romeo and Juliet Revolution, prevailed in the West by the 17th century. Even claims for equal rights for all, the poorest he in England has a life to live as much as the richest he, were articulated, if not universally accepted. Individualism remains a distinguishing feature of the West in the 20th century civilizations. In one analysis involving similar population groups from 50 countries, the 20 countries scoring highest on the individualism index included 19 of the 20 Western countries in the sample. The above is not, okay, so those are all Huntington's main elements that he identifies of Western civilization. Right. Yeah, so you guys are enjoying this essay so far. I know I was looking forward to reading it to the audience tonight, seeing as I'm such a big fan of it myself. But yeah, I'm glad you guys are sticking with me here, and the audience is growing. All right, but let's continue. There's still a lot to go. Huntington continues. The above is not an exhaustive list of the distinctive characteristics of Western civilization, nor is it meant to imply that these characteristics were always and everywhere in present Western society. But they obviously were not. The many despots in Western history regularly ignored the rule of law and suspended representative bodies, nor is it meant to suggest that none of these characteristics have appeared in other civilizations. They obviously have. The Quran and the Sharia constitute basic law for Islamic societies. Japan and India had class systems paralleling that of the West, and perhaps as a result are the only two major non-Western societies to sustain democratic governments for any length of time. Individually, almost none of these factors is unique to the West, but the combination of them is. That's a very important point. So he lists all these different factors that he thinks are some of the core aspects of Western civilization, but now he emphasizes that individually almost none of these factors are unique to the West, but the combination of them is unique to the West. They are what is Western, but not modern about the West. They generated the commitment to individual freedom that distinguishes the West from other civilizations. They are also the factors that enabled the West to take the lead in modernizing itself and the world. The West is and will remain for years to come the most powerful civilization. Yet its power relative to other civilizations is declining. As the West attempts to assert its values and to protect its interests, non-Western societies face a choice. Some attempt to emulate the West. Others, especially Confucian and Islamic societies, attempt to expand their own economic and military power to resist and balance the West. A central axis of post-Cold War politics is the Let me rephrase it. My emphasis there was wrong. A central axis of post-Cold War politics is the interaction of Western power and culture with the power and culture of non-Western civilizations. That's a very important point. So I'm going to maybe read it again just to emphasize it. A central axis of post-Cold War politics is the interaction of Western power and culture with the power and culture of non-Western civilizations. And he's going to now elaborate on this. Peter the Great and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk were determined to modernize their countries and believed that what they were doing so meant adopting Western culture, even to the point of replacing traditional headgear with its Western equivalent. They created torn countries, unsure of their cultural identity. The main torn countries in the world today are Russia, torn between Slavophile orthodoxy and the West. Next, Turkey, Mexico, and Australia, the latter trying to delink itself from the West and become part of Asia. More often, leaders of non Western societies have pursued modernization and rejected westernization. Their goal is summed up in the phrase Woken Yosei, Japanese spirit, Western technique. That's also a very important point. It's actually a point that Flip Base also often makes about the difference between westernization and modernization, articulated by Japanese reformers of a century ago. And in Saudi Arabia's Prince Bandar bin Sultan's comment in 1994 that foreign imports are nice as shiny or high-tech things, but intangible social and political institutions imported from elsewhere can be deadly, asked the Shah of Iran. Islam is, and this his quote continues, Islam is for us not just a religion but a way of life. We Saudis want to modernize, not necessarily westernize. End quote. Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser degree Iran have become modern societies without becoming Western societies. China is clearly modernizing, but certainly not westernizing. And again, just to add that context, this all was written in 1997. So that's the context that this was written in, just a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union. All right, let's continue here. Interaction and borrowing between civilizations have always taken place, and with modern means of transport and communication are much more expensive. But China's absorption of Buddhism from India failed to produce the indigenization of China. It instead caused the sinification of Buddhism. Modernization and economic development not only wait, who said that was it Solzhenitsyn? Who said about France and Morocco? Was it Algeria? I just want to check that because I think this. Oh yeah, uh, yeah, it seems that that quote's not loading now. But anyway, let's see again. Modernization and economic development not only does not require cultural westernization, it often promotes the opposite, a resurgence of indigenous cultures. At the individual level, the movement of people into unfamiliar cities and occupations breaks their traditional local bonds, generates feelings of alienation, and creates crises of identity to which religion frequently provides an answer. Modernization also increases the wealth and military power of a country and thus encourages people to have confidence in their heritage. The global revival of religion is a direct consequence of modernization, according to Huntington. In non-Western societies, it almost necessarily assumes an anti-Western cast. In some cases, rejecting Western culture because it is Christian and subversive. In others, because it is secular and degenerate. The return to the indigenous is most marked in Muslim and Asian societies. The Islamic resurgence has manifested itself in every Muslim country, often becoming a major social, cultural, and intellectual movement with deep impact on politics. In 1997, virtually every Muslim country except Iran was more Islamist than it was 15 years earlier. Uh, I wonder what Huntington is saying about Afghanistan, or said. Maybe I should just make sure if he is still with us, just to make sure I'm not disrespectful. Okay. So yeah, unfortunately, Mr. Huntington is no longer with us. He passed on to the here yonder in 2008. So rest in peace. So yeah, now I know which tends to use, but yeah, that's unfortunate to see. I wonder. Well, then maybe I should rephrase. I wonder what he would have said about the Afghanistan fiasco of this year. Oh yeah, I see. You guys have been pointing out Algeria, not Morocco. Yeah, Yeah, my mind is in two places at the moment. I can't look up the quote that I was thinking of, and at the same time check here. But yeah, maybe I should. It's bothering me now. If I remember correctly, it's actually a Nassim Taleb quote, but my memory could be failing me. Let's see here. Oh, that's not working. Um, all these links aren't working. I've actually found. Maybe it's because I'm blocked by Nassim Taleb. That's why I can't see it. Oh, here we go. I think I've got it now. Yeah, so the quote is France took Algeria hoping for a country to eat cassoulet. I don't know what that is. And instead, France is now eating couscous. But yeah, I think that actually links up to here what Huntington was saying. Yeah. Well, yes, yeah, it wasn't Albert Camus that talked about this, but he was Algerian, yes. Actually, his book, The Outsider, is one of my favorite books. Yeah, the Stranger is actually I think the more correct translation. I see 700T16 says, I'm late. Have another like. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Alice says, surely modernization should also be considered from the West. I get not on a social level, but it was in Western philosophy creativity that led to the level. But well, he's going to get into that because yeah, I think the essay will answer that question a lot better. He's going to get into that modernization question quite a bit, if I remember correctly, not too far from here. So let's see. Here we go. So, in the countries where Islamist political forces do not shape the government, they invariably dominate the opposition to the government. Throughout the Western world, people are reacting against the West toxification of their societies. Now, that's a word, the West toxification of their societies. East Asian societies have gone through a parallel rediscovery of indigenous values and have increasingly drawn unflattering comparisons between their culture and Western culture. For several centuries, they along with other non-Western peoples, envied the economic prosperity, technological sophistication, military power, and political cohesion of Western societies. They sought the secret of this success in Western practices and customs and attempted to apply it in their own societies. Today, East Asians attribute their dramatic economic development not to the import of Western culture, but to their adherence to their own culture. They have succeeded, they argue, not because they became like the West, but because they have remained different from the West. When non Western societies felt weak in relation to the West, many of their leaders invoked Western values of self determination, liberalism, democracy, and freedom to justify their opposition to Western global domination. Now that they are no longer weak, they denounce as human rights imperialism, the same values that they previously invoked to promote their interests as Western power recedes. So too does the appeal of Western values and culture. Much of the world is becoming more modern and less Western. That's the important point. Let's just see. I see the lad himself. Courage, my lads. Scott Tonga is in the chat. Thank you very much for tuning in. And thank you very much for the congratulations as well. He says, happy 100, episode 100. Thank you very much. And then he says, good evening, Kings. Good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in. Luel asks a very good question. What are the West indigenous values? Never thought of it like that before. Very good question. Maybe something to ponder. But I have to continue. my time, I'm a bit pressed for time. So let's see. Okay. Huntington continues. One manifestation of this trend of, let me just reverse a little bit. As Western power recedes, so too does the appeal of Western values and culture. Much of the world is becoming more modern and less Western. One manifestation of this trend is what Ronald Dahl has termed the second generation indigenization phenomenon. Both in former Western colonies and in continuously independent non-Western countries, the first modernizer or post-independence generation has often received its training in foreign Western universities in a Western cosmopolitan language, partly because they first go abroad as impressionable teenagers. Their absorption of Western values may well be profound. In contrast, members of the much larger second generation receive their education at home in universities, at home being in their home country, in universities, the first generation established, where the local language is used for instruction. These universities provide a much more diluted contact with metropolitan world culture. Graduates of these universities resent the dominance of the earlier Western trained generation and thus often succumb to the appeals of nativist opposition movements. And that's probably, not probably, I think definitely where you see these calls for decolonization that you see everywhere coming from. This type of mentality definitely plays into that. Even some of the first generation had to adapt it to their identities. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Harry Lee, and Solomon Bandaranaike, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, were three brilliant graduates of Oxford, Cambridge, and Lincoln's Inn, respectively, superb lawyers and thoroughly westernized members of their societies. Jinnah was a committed secularist. Lee was, in the words of one British cabinet minister, the best bloody Englishman east of the Suez. Bandaranaike was raised a Christian, yet to lead their nations, they reverted to their ancestral cultures. The secularist Jinnah became Quaid-i-Azam, the fervent apostle of Islam, as the basis for the Pakistani state. Harry Lee became Lee Kuan Yew, learned Mandarin and promoted Confucianism, and the Christian Bandaranaike converted to Buddhism and appealed to Sinhalese nationalism. Indigenization is furthered by the democracy paradox. Now, this is a very important point that he makes: the connection between democracy and anti-Western sentiment. Before I read this essay, I never thought about it this way. I see here. All right, now I was thinking someone had a question. Wait, no, I actually read. No, I didn't. When non-Western societies adopt Western-style elections, democracy often brings to power anti-Western political movements. In the 1960s and 1970s, pro-Western governments in the developing countries were threatened by coups and revolutions. In the 1980s and 1990s, they have been increasingly in danger of being ousted in elections. Democracy tends to make a society more parochial, not more cosmopolitan. Politicians in non-Western societies do not win elections by demonstrating how Western they are. Electoral competition stimulates them to fashion what they believe will be the most popular appeals, and those are often ethnic, nationalist, and religious in character. That's a very, very important and incisive point. This process, which began in Sri Lanka in the 1950s, has spread through Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and is manifest in the success of religiously orientated parties in India, Turkey, Bosnia, and Israel in elections in 1995 and 1996. Democratization is thus at odds with westernization. A good example of this would be in the South African context, former President Mbeki's dream of an African Renaissance. And that wasn't a dream of westernizing Africa, it was a dream of modernizing Africa without westernizing it and rediscovering all these values from the continent and from African culture, which is exactly what Huntington's talking about here. Let's see. All right. Huntington continues. Wait, let me just have a sip here. The powerful currents of indigenization, I'm going to be struggling with that word for the rest of the essay. The powerful currents of indigenization at work in the world make a mockery of Western expectations that Western culture will become the world's culture. The two central elements of any culture are language and religion. That's very, very, very pertinent and very incisive that he notes that. As an Afrikaner, I understand. English, it has been said, is becoming the world's language. It clearly has become the lingua franca for communication in multinational business, diplomacy, tourism, and aviation. But the proportion of the world's population speaking English is small and declining. According to data compiled by Sidney Coulbert, a professor at the University of Washington, in 1958, roughly 9.8% of human beings spoke English as a first or second language. In 1992, 7.6% did. A language foreign to 92% of the world's population is not the world's language. Similarly, in 1958, 24% of humans spoke one of 5 major Western languages. In 1992, less than 21% did. The situation is similar for religion. Western Christians now make up perhaps 30% of the world's population, but the proportion is declining. At some point in the coming decades, Muslims will exceed Christians. As Michael Howard has observed, the common Western assumption that cultural diversity is a historical curiosity being rapidly eroded by the growth of a common Western-orientated Anglophone world culture shaping our basic values is simply not true. As indigenization, spreads and the appeal of Western culture fades, the central problem in relation between the West and the rest is the gap between the West's efforts to promote Western culture as the universal culture and its declining ability to do so. That quote, that little sentence there, is the absolute crux of this essay. This is the golden nugget, where the golden thread goes through, and it goes through this golden nugget here. And I'm going to repeat it. As indigenization spreads and the appeal of Western culture fades, the central problem in relations between the West and the rest is the gap between the West's efforts to promote Western culture as the universal culture and its declining ability to do so. The collapse of communism exacerbated this disparity by reinforcing the view in the West that its ideology of democratic liberalism had triumphed globally and was thus universally valid. The West, and especially the US, which has always been a missionary nation, believed that the non-Western people should commit themselves to the Western values of democracy, free markets, limited government, separation of church and state, human rights, individualism, and the rule of law. Minorities in other civilizations embrace these values, but the dominant attitudes towards them in non-Western cultures range from skepticism to intense opposition. And here's a quote that Flabase actually uses quite a bit. He used this quote, and I actually wanted to know where it came from, and he said from this essay, and that's how I came upon this essay. What is universalism for the West is imperialism for the rest. That's another crux of this essay. Let's see, I'm going back to the chat just to make sure you guys are nice and cozy and enjoying the stream, and there's no technical problems or anything that's bothering you. Let's see, everyone seems very content. Gatskop Software says, hello, Arends. Hello, Gatskop Software. And as I always do, go check out him on social media, on Twitter, and I think he's on Facebook as well. Confirm in the chat, please, Gatskop Software. He's making a Boer War game, and he's doing marvelous work, and I really, really like seeing what he's doing. I see a sideliner opinion says all these differences are just problems for globalists, not to people. Wait, I put the emphasis on wrong again. All these differences are just problems for globalists, not to people who want to be left alone to be what they are. Dagbreker says, CC, that is a fantastic point. I think he's referring to that last bit that I read. I'm glad you got some insight from it. I certainly did. Now, Huntington continues, because I want to finish this essay. We've got 10 minutes, but I think I'm going to make it. Huntington continues. Non-Westerners do not hesitate to point to the gaps between Western principle and practice. Hypocrisy and double standards are the price of universalist pretensions. Democracy is promoted, but not if it brings Islamic fundamentalists to power. Before we continue, he's going to list a few examples from more closer to his time when he was writing this essay. But haven't we seen so much of this Western hypocrisy recently? I mean, we saw, for example, what happened in Canada this year was horrific in regards to the abuse of protesters, the silencing of dissent, the censorship, the shutting down of bank accounts, trampling by police horses of protesters. The type of stuff where if it were to happen in a non-Western country, that country's democracy index points or freedom index points would drop like a rock. But Canada is not going to lose any points on those indexes. I wonder why. So now he's going to list some other examples. I mean, I could go into many modern examples as well, but yeah, for the sake of time, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to. Um, Democracy is promoted, but not if it brings Islamic fundamentalists to power. Just one final point, that whole phrase of a threat to our democracy. Democracy works when it brings progressive leftists or liberals into power. Democracy is under threat or being destroyed if it brings conservatives or populists into power. That's the hypocrisy that we see. I mean, we saw that all too well since 2016. Non-proliferation is preached for Iran and Iraq, but not for Israel. Free trade is the elixir of economic growth, but not for agriculture. Human rights are an issue with China, but not with Saudi Arabia. Aggression against oil-owning Kuwaitis is repulsed with massive force, but not so against oil-less Bosnians. Uh, these are the type of examples, and like I say, these are examples from his time, and since many else has happened. Another good example would be what we are seeing currently in the Ukraine situation. I mean, I'm not going to get into that. That's a completely massive different topic. But for example, if Ukraine were to join NATO and you had American missiles on the Russian border, what would be the counter scenario? Would be the Cuban Missile Crisis or Russian nukes on the southern American border in Mexico. That's what Huntington's talking about here. The belief that non-Western people should adopt Western values is, if taken seriously, immoral in its implications. Now, to many people, this will be a very controversial point to many Westerners, but he explains it very well. So bear with Huntington here. I'm going to go from the top again. The belief that non-Western peoples should adopt Western values, if taken seriously, is, if taken seriously, immoral in its implications. The most universal reach of European power in the late 19th century and the global dominance of the US in the later half of the 20th century spread many aspects of Western civilization across the world. But European globalism is no more, and US hegemony, is it hegemony? Hegemony? I don't know which one is the Americanization. And US hegemony is receding, if only because it is no longer needed against the Soviet threat. Culture follows power. There's another incisive point. If non-Western societies are once again shaped by Western culture, it will happen only as a result of the expansion of Western power. So as Western power recedes, the less and less societies are going to be shaped by Western values. That's the implication here. Imperialism is the necessary consequence of universalism. Yet few proponents of universalism support the militarization that would be necessary to achieve their goal. Furthermore, as a maturing civilization, and here in 1997, Huntington cuts to the core of a major issue in the West, and he touches on it here. Furthermore, as a maturing civilization, the West no longer has the economic or demographic dynamism required to impose its will on others. Any effort to do so also runs contrary to Western values of self-determination and democracy. Yeah, he nails it. Hammer, meat, nail. As Asian and Muslim civilizations begin to assert the universal relevance of their cultures, Westerners will see the connection between universalism and imperialism and appreciate the virtues of a pluralistic world. This is a point that I see increasingly people are making. Universalism and imperialism is very nice as long as you're in the hegemonic seat of power. When you're no longer in power and you're no longer the global hegemon, imperialism takes on a completely different form, and then you're going to have a bad time. In March 1997, he says this reversal is already happening. In March 1997, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia told the assembled heads of European governments, and I quote, "European values are European values. Asian values are universal values." Does that sound familiar? Just a rhetorical question. The decreasing ability of the West to achieve its goals against the rising civilizations was revealed at the UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in June 1993. On one side were the European and North American countries. On the other side was a bloc of about 50 non-Western states. the 15 most active members of which include the governments of the Latin American country Cuba, of one Latin American country, Cuba, one Buddhist country, Myanmar, four Confucian countries, Singapore, Vietnam, North Korea, and China, and nine Muslim countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and Libya. The leadership of this Asian Islamic group came from China, Syria, and Iran. In between these two groupings were most Latin American countries, which often supported the West, and African and Orthodox countries, which sometimes supported but more often opposed the West. 2 months before the Vienna Conference, the Asian countries met in Bangkok and endorsed a declaration which emphasized that human rights must be considered in the context of national and regional particularities and various historical, religious, and cultural backgrounds. It also declared that human rights monitoring violated sovereignty. Interesting concept, that. Before I wait, let me just finish this story of Huntington. The Western nations were ill prepared for Vienna. They were outnumbered at the conference and made the most concessions. The declaration approved by the conference was a minimal one, weaker than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights the UN adopted in 1948. After the conference, an Asian critic of the West said, and I quote, "For the first time since the Universal Declaration of countries not steeped in the Judeo-Christian and natural law traditions..." Oh, wait, I put the emphasis wrong again. For the first time since the Universal Declaration, countries not steeped in the Judeo-Christian and natural law traditions are in the first rank. That unprecedented situation will define the new international politics of human rights. It will also multiply the occasions for conflict, close quote. All right, and then he continues. I just want to check the chat again before I continue. Let's see. I see my camera is very small on the display, but I mean, I don't know if StreamYard how to make that bigger. Yeah, whatever. What happens when I do this? No, that's worse. If I do that, you can't read. Fine, I'll do it like this. My face is not the important part of the stream. So let's see. I'm just checking the chat. Dagbreker says, "This is fantastic. Can you share this essay? There's a link in the description if you want to share it yourself or read it again." I'm almost done. Sideline Opinion says, "Greetings from a hot Africa." Hatskop Software says, "We have load shedding at 8. See you guys later." Oh, shame, man. Good luck. Let's see. All right. Let me finish this essay, and then we can see if we can chat a little bit before I say goodbye. The governments of Muslim countries are likely to continue to become less friendly to the West. Relations between the US on the one hand and China, Japan, and other Asian countries will also be highly conflictual. And a war could occur if the US challenges China's rise as the hegemonic power in Asia. Meanwhile, the smaller pressure points in the world politics will be on the fault lines between civilizations. Witness the fighting in Bosnia, Chechnya, the Middle East, Kashmir, and many other places. What should... Here we go. Okay, final stretch now. This is the final paragraph, and it is... This essay ends on such a succinct and such a powerful paragraph. So buckle up. It's so good. So Huntington ends this phenomenal essay with a few normative statements. He says, "What should the United States and Europe do to preserve Western civilization? The West needs greater unity of purpose to prevent states from other civilizations exploiting differences. It should incorporate into the EU and NATO the Western states of Central Europe, encourage the Westernization of Latin America, slow the drift of Japan away from the West towards accommodation with China." And here, this point, now take this in the context of 2022, "and accept Russia as the core state of orthodoxy and a power with legitimate interests." Very incisive observation 25 years ago. "The main responsibility of Western leaders is to recognize that intervention in the affairs of other civilizations is the single most dangerous..." I want to put the emphasis here properly because it's so important. The main responsibility of Western leaders is to recognize that intervention in the affairs of other civilizations is the single most dangerous source of instability in the world. The West, my tongue is getting tired. The, the West should not attempt to reshape other civilizations in its own image, but preserve and renew the unique qualities of Western civilization. Such an important point. Going to repeat. The West should not attempt to reshape other civilizations in its own image, but preserve and renew the unique qualities of Western civilization. Get your own house in order. That responsibility falls overwhelmingly on the most powerful Western country, the United States. Neither globalism nor isolationism, neither multilateralism nor unilateralism will best serve US interests. Its interests will be advanced if it instead adopts an Atlanticist policy of close cooperation with Europe, one that will protect the interests and values of the precious and unique civilization they share. So just for context, Samuel Huntington, this says is, but was, a professor at Harvard University and author of The Clash of Civilizations, a book that I still need to read, and the remaking of World Order. Actually, two books that I think you can put on your list, even though I haven't read it yet, if it's anything like this essay. Right. And we are back. Right, that was a mouthful, that whole essay, but yeah, I wanted to read it for episode 100. Not only because it is one of my favorite essays, political essays, if not favorite political essay, but because it's so pertinent and incisive and so relevant to what's going on in the world in 2022, but also in the past few years. Yeah, I'm checking just the chat to see what I've missed. I see Years the Eunuch is here. Good day, evening, all. Good day, good evening. Goeienaand. Luel says, I see Russia as part of the West because of its orthodoxy. Very interesting point. Years says, I will watch and listen to all of it. Just wanted to pop in while I can to say hi. Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. I still have to finish Prudentialist stream from last night. I'm also listening to that stream. I was listening to it on my way to work, and then load shedding cut out the signal. So I didn't have data on my phone to finish or to listen to the rest of it. Let's see. Seamus says, most progressives are universalists, which blinds them to their own arrogance and ignorance and colonialist tendencies. And that's the truth. Sideline Opinion says, the West has abandoned orthodoxy with wokeness and CRT being the new gods. All right. Well, I'm just going to, again, say thanks to the sponsor tonight before we get into final thoughts. The sponsor of tonight's episode is once again Bitvice. Bitvice is the only place in South Africa that sells Bitcoin direct to your self-custody, meaning that unlike a traditional crypto exchange, you don't have to trust anyone to hold your Bitcoin for you. This removes the largest risk associated with Bitcoin. If you're interested in learning about Bitcoin, check out their podcast, By the Horns. It's available on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. They release weekly episodes and focus specifically on the South African context surrounding Bitcoin and crypto. The Bitvice team has also been hard at work making sure some changes to their product over the past few months. You may remember that their minimum purchase size was 20,000 Rand, but it has been reduced to 5,000 Rand recently. You can now buy Bitcoin directly to your hardware wallet in a matter of seconds. There's a link in the description if you've been thinking about getting into crypto, you've been thinking about maybe learning just a few things about Bitcoin. Go check out their podcast, By the Horns, and go check out their website as well. You can get into contact with them with all your questions. Real good guys. They helped me set up my wallets and all my crypto stuff, even though I'm not very big into crypto. All right. That brings us to the end. Once again, I just wanted to say thank you very much for everyone that has stuck with this channel over the years. And it's nice to see many of you still here 100 episodes later. It's remarkable stuff, and it's really inspiring and motivates me to make more. And it's still a bit mind blowing that people tune in to listen to an hour of my analysis and of my streams. It's really humbling and really flattering. Thank you very much. I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, and to many more. All right, and maybe for if you are for some reason on this stream the first time that you've tuned into my channel, I don't know how you got here, but welcome. And if you like this type of content, you can subscribe. You can also or was it, oh, there we're back now. I don't know if what you've missed there. Maybe I've cut out a little bit. Maybe I didn't. I hope I didn't. But anyway, live. Yeah, there I am now. All right. So my internet seems to be hiccuping a little bit, so I'm just going to use this opportunity now to say goodbye. Thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you very much again from the bottom of my heart to the next 100 episodes. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.